Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.
Welcome to another edition of the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Ray. So good to have you. Today, we have a author on again. It's been a while since we had on an author, Meredith Angwin, who has wrote a book about nuclear energy, but she's for it. And so kind of an interesting take on nuclear. You know, in the news, you see a lot of people who are anti-nuclear, but not Meredith. She is pro-nuclear and passionate about it. So I hope you enjoyed my discussion I had with her the other day. Meredith, thanks for joining us today. How are you doing?
Fine, thank you. Glad to be here, Ryan.
Okay, so I've got to ask, you've got a book about nuclear energy and you're for it. So it's called Campaigning for Clean Air, Strategies for Pro-Nuclear Advocacy. What in the world would make you write such a book like that?
Well, I'm in favor of nuclear energy, and there are some really excellent books which explain the positive aspects of nuclear energy. Books like Campaigning for Clean Air by Gwyneth Craven. She wrote that about 8 years ago. But there weren't any books that would tell you how to be in favor of nuclear energy. What do you do? So now you're in favor of it. I mean, there's many books that end, and so support nuclear energy, and then what do you do about it? So I was attempting to support nuclear energy, and I realized that having been a relatively nerdy person all my life, I'd had no idea how to do this. So I ended up, somebody called me up to be in a debate against some practically professional anti-nuclear people who were part of a big organization and debated many times before. And I said, well, can't you get someone else? Oh, no, we've tried, I said, okay. And then I thought, what have I got myself into? So, I mean, that I wrote at the end of the introduction of the book, I said, this is the book that I wish I had had when I was about to show up at the Tracy Library a couple of years ago and debate these people.
Absolutely. So I've got to ask, a lot of people don't come naturally to nuclear. So is nuclear something that you've been passionate about for a long time, or was it a long journey?
It was a journey. Now, it's both that I've been passionate about it for a long time, and it was a journey. I started out wanting to work in renewables, absolutely. And I was so pleased with myself because I have a master's in physical chemistry, and I got to be a project manager at the Electric Power Research Institute in renewables. I mean, I thought, wow, it can't get better than this. I'm at the Electric Power Research Institute. We have a budget, and we're encouraging renewables. Unfortunately, as I went along in it, I began to realize that they were kind of not up to the job of taking over from coal and taking over from natural gas. And so when I began working somewhat on a technical issue with the nuclear people, and when they asked me to join, I was like, yeah, that's great. I will join. But of course, even that wasn't the end of the journey. When I joined them, they had been pro-nuclear all their lives, and so when I would say things like, well, what will you do with the waste? They were like, it's not a problem. And I'm like, well, can you explain why it's not a problem? And eventually I figured out the reasons it's not a problem, but it was a journey. But by the end of the journey, I'm absolutely convinced that the nuclear is the power to save the world.
Now, I have to ask, because I've read somewhere that you've led rallies and stuff to that effect, so you're very passionate about nuclear, even to the point of maybe even rallying people together. Is that correct?
That is correct. The opponents often went down to downtown Brattleboro with signs and so forth. So, for example, at one point, there were a series of hearings about whether Vermont Yankee should stay open or not. And the opponents were there, and they were with signs, and they were like with vigils and talking about how dangerous it was, and nobody was answering them. I mean, the plant obviously wasn't going to send people there, and I thought this is such a one-sided story. And by that point, I had been in debates, and I had written letters to the editor, and I'd done all sorts of things, and it seemed like the next step was to be out there on the street with a sign. And so I gathered a whole bunch of people together. I mean, not just me. I use a lot of I because you're interviewing me, but
right.
It's really important to have a group, to be a part of a movement, to be part of a community. So many people from our community showed up, and held signs and were ready to be interviewed by the press. And so that the report on that day was pro and anti-nuclear people rally in front of the courthouse as opposed to anti-nuclear rally, etc.
Right, and it's interesting because usually when you hear of rallies for energy, it's on the environmental side. Kind of trying to shut stuff down, and so it's kind of an interesting dynamic there that you've almost kind of flipped the script on them.
Well, I consider myself to be on the environmental side. I mean, Vermont Yankee eventually closed down, and the carbon dioxide intensity, 5% more carbon dioxide was emitted from the New England grid the year after it shut down, because you see, we've got all these gas-fired plants, and the gas-fired plants are turned on more because there's not a nuclear plant. They have to make it up somehow. You don't even have to build a new plant for the carbon dioxide content to go up, because a lot of gas-fired plants run only part-time, and so if a nuclear plant is no longer available, they run more, and then you have more carbon dioxide. I consider myself very much an environmentalist, but I also consider that we have to not let the people who are anti-nuclear environmentalists get the whole title of we are the true environmentalists. No, they're not. They don't care about the environment if they don't want the best, the most efficient, low carbon source of electricity that's available.
Well, and that was my point, is that, I know I was kind of picking at you there, because it's funny that you are very concerned about the environment, and yet if you went to the Sierra Club or wherever, a large environmental group, they would say, no, you're anti-environment. And that's one of the things that gets lost in this debate about, how do we take energy to third world or developing nations? What should we do? How we think about it is that you really, as far as what I'm calling environmentalist movement at least, it's very hard to figure out how do you fit in there, because it seems like there's a lot of bad stuff, and then the good stuff doesn't really work well sometimes, not always, but sometimes. And so it kind of puts you in a rough spot. But I want to ask you about this, because one of the things is, I remember in high school growing up, and there was a nuclear plant. It was nowhere near us, but it was, I don't know, let's say 100 miles away. I can't remember exactly how far. And my science teacher was talking about, well, if the nuclear plant were to melt down, this would happen. So I want you to kind of walk us through some of the big fears that people have against nuclear energy, and kind of dispel some of the myths from the facts for us.
Well, one of the big fears is that the nuclear plant would melt down, and then it would be the equivalent of the final scenes in the movie On the Beach.
Mm-hmm. Right.
In other words, everybody dies.
Right.
And that actually is so untrue. It's almost unbelievable. Now, look at it the following way. Let's say that there's a different kind of poison around, smoke, okay? Mm-hmm. Well, you could, if you're near a big fire, you could die of smoke inhalation, or if you ingest a lot of smoke because you're a smoker, you have a heightened chance of cancer. Well, it's the same kind of thing with radiation. If there's a lot of radiation, it could kill you, and if there's less but still a fair amount of radiation, it could increase your risk for cancer. Well, what happens is that there has only been one nuclear accident, and that was in Russia, when anybody died from direct radiation.
I want to interject there real quick. I hate to cut you off, but that's important to note, because one of the things I heard someone the other day talked about was, I think it was 3 Mile Island, and they said that there was a few deaths to 3 Mile Island, but it had to do with the evacuation of elderly people, not directly related to the nuclear spill itself. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, 3 Mile Island, I don't know about any deaths associated with it. It is definitely the case that in Fukushima, they evacuated all these elderly people. They were taking them away in buses. The people were cold. They didn't have their medicines. They sometimes fell off the seat of the bus, and many people died. I think the estimates are about 1,000 people died due to the evacuation.
You're right. It may be that. It may be Fukushima. I'm thinking of, not 3 Mile.
Yeah, it is Fukushima. Now, it is that you have to understand that the amount of radiation that was released didn't kill anybody and wouldn't have killed anybody. It might have increased the chances of cancer. But what I'm talking about, if you're 80 years old, being evacuated and dying because you get cold and you don't have your medicine, I mean,
right.
What is this increases chances of cancer stuff? I mean, that is just, in most situations, they would have been so much better not to evacuate, to have everybody shelter in place for about 24 hours or 48 hours, and then which is often done when, like, there's a refinery fire. They'll say, stay in your houses, don't go outside, don't breathe the air, and then in a day or two it clears away. They could have done that, but they didn't. They evacuated people and killed people. As I say, people are always saying that nuclear is killing people, and then what they'll do is they'll take the supposed increase in cancer, which is very hard to detect, and they'll run it over a big population. They'll say, 2 million people were affected, therefore 2,000 will get cancer, therefore
Right.
this plant killed 2,000 people. And everybody thinks it's the equivalent of somebody was killed in an explosion. It isn't.
Right.
It's a theoretical construct of what may or may not be about to happen.
Right. And that was the thing about the Fukushima deal when I was hearing to talk about the evacuation and the people that died from that. It was kind of sad because you're thinking, okay, here's an evacuation, and you have people with good motives. They're trying to help people, but the result is worse than if they would have stayed potentially. And it seems that for a lot of people, at least, that a nuclear bomb is equated to a nuclear meltdown. And from what I understand about Fukushima, it wasn't really a true meltdown as even we would think about it. I know it's kind of a complicated topic maybe for someone like myself, but those two things aren't even on the same playing field, correct?
That's correct. A nuclear bomb is a planned explosion which is supposed to put out as much heat, radiation, blast, wind as it possibly can. A nuclear meltdown means that the fuel in the plant melted, and it is generally contained within the plant. I mean, 3 Mile Island melted down, but it released almost no radiation outside of the plant, and that was when people didn't even know much about it. As I say, the Japanese evacuation was just unreasonable.
Right. So give me some other stuff that people might look at and say, okay, these are things that you hear objections to nuclear that may not exactly be true as well.
Well, there are a lot of them, but the main thing is the endless fear of radiation, and then there's the idea that somehow nuclear hurts the ecology, and then they don't know what to say about it, so they say, well, it warms up, the cooling towers warm up the whatever they're, or the river, they get heat gets dumped
Right.
into the river or into the cooling towers, and actually that's true. I mean, because any kind of machine, which is called a heat engine, which is the machine that takes some fuel and burns it and turns that into mechanical energy, has to dump a lot of heat. Think of the heat engine you own. You own a car. It burns a fuel. It turns it into mechanical energy that turns the wheels. And your car has elaborate methods for dumping the heat. You've got the radiator, you've got the water pump, you've got the fan. I mean, because every heat engine has to dump heat. So when people begin saying, well, nuclear dumps heat, well, yeah, sure.
Right.
It does.
What doesn't? Yeah. Right. Okay, so one of the things we had on Alex Epstein a few episodes back, it's been quite a few now, and I was watching some debates this weekend with him and some folks from the Sierra Club and different organizations, and one of the things that kind of comes up with nuclear is what we're going to call the environmentalists for this point here is they would say, well, nuclear is just too expensive, it's just not economical, and Alex would say, well, right, because you made it that way, and so it kind of seems now that nuclear is just kind of swept under the rug because it's so expensive, when yet uranium's plentiful. And, the permitting process is obviously a pain, but it seems that the environmental movement has made it so expensive that it's not reasonable to do it. And then they come back and say, well, we would consider it, but it's just so expensive now. Am I missing something there?
That is absolutely true. I mean, some of the plants that are just running beautifully for so many years in America, many of the plants were what they call turnkey plants. That is, the plant was built by the builder on a basis that when it was done, it was sort of a fixed price, and when it was done, it would be handed over and run. And they did that. And then one of the nuclear plants, somebody in one of my email lists was looking into this, and there was one nuclear plant, and I don't know which one it was, that was originally planned to be staffed by 80 people. And when it first began running, it was staffed by 80 people. Mm-hmm. And then with all the regulations on safety and checking and this and that and the other thing, the plant ended up being staffed by 400 people, and then it was too expensive to run. Well,
right.
Yeah.
Right. And one of the things, if I understand correctly, about nuclear plants, at least in the U.S., is they're kind of built with a 60-year life expectancy. And after 60 years, they either build another one or shut it down or whatever they're going to do. And that's a lot of stable jobs for a local economy.
Oh, it is. It's tremendous. And the thing is that they're really hard jobs to replace, because the people who work in nuclear plants, they are hardworking, often very well educated. They are, many of them come from military service, especially the Navy, and they have a very strong volunteerism feeling that you've got to give back to your community. I mean, when Vermont Yankee closed down, I don't know what the volunteer fire departments in the area did, because most of their people, I mean, I shouldn't say most, I don't know if it was most, but
Right.
a lot of their people came from Vermont Yankee.
Right.
And so yes, it's really dreadful in that sense. And the nuclear plants are designed for 60 years. They're designed really well. How long was the Brooklyn Bridge designed for? I mean, it's a nonsensical question. And
Right.
if you keep it up and you keep repairing it, it can keep going for a really long time. It's not a matter of that it's about to fall down because it's a really old bridge. I mean, you have to keep inspecting it. You have to keep repairing it. And the same as with nuclear plants. They were licensed for 40 years with the expectation that at the end of 40 years, they would have to undergo a lot of inspection to get a further license. I mean, perfectly reasonable.
Right. Okay, so before I let you go, I've got to ask, your book, and we're going to link to the book in the show notes so the listeners can go and check it out. It's on Kindle and it's on paperback as well. Your book has been compared to James Carville, of all people's, Buck Up and Suck Up book. And so I'm not really sure, that would seem like an odd comparison for someone who's pro-nuclear and James Carville. I don't know Carville's position on nuclear, but it just kind of seems like an odd comparison. So what's that all about?
Well, what that was all about is that my book is about how anybody can be pro-nuclear, how anybody can be an advocate, that if you don't want to go marching around on the streets with signs, you can still write letters to the editor. You can do a blog about your plant that tells the other side when the newspaper is writing the article that is, if it bleeds, it leads. You can write about what's really going on without exaggerating whatever the issue might be. So my book is about that. And it was compared to Carville because Carville basically has this whole book, Buck Up, Suck Up, about how to win a political campaign. And he's got like 10 points of what you should do to win a political campaign. Well, my book doesn't have 10 points, but it has a chapter about, letter writing, the tricks of the trade, or blogging, or active expert help, how to get information. So mine is very, very practical, and his is also very practical, but of course with totally different aims.
Well, that would make sense now that you've kind of explained it. Okay. So we're going to link to the book in the show notes, and the listeners can find that at globalenergymedia.com, and we will link to it at Amazon. Is there anywhere else that you can get the book at?
Well, I think that it'd be nice, if people go to my meredithangwin.com website, I often have blog posts on things you can do for nuclear, and I link to when I'm on this podcast or other podcasts or articles that appear in various places that I've written or that refer to me. So there's a lot of good information about being pro-nuclear, including how you can be pro-nuclear right now. What's an issue going on, and you can write a letter about it or something like that.
Absolutely. So we will link to your website in the show notes as well. Well, Meredith, this has been really a pleasure for me, and continue doing this. I enjoy these types of discussions, and one of the things on this show we've tried to say over and over and over again is that we want people to have energy. And we kind of, sometimes in the debate, it kind of gets lost that, people need energy. And right now we're using energy to talk to each other, and we're nowhere near each other, right? And so we just kind of assume, sitting here in America, that, well, energy's, it could be bad, it could be evil. Well, okay, that's a discussion to have, but there's so many people around the world that need energy, and they don't have it. And energy affects so many areas. And so I'm thankful for someone like you who said, hey, here's a way to look at nuclear and at least give the other side a balance, as you said. So thank you for coming on, and hope to have you on again.
Thank you very much, Ryan. I enjoyed it.
Thanks again to Meredith for coming on. Really enjoyed the discussion. Be sure to check out her website and the book. You can find all that information at the show notes at globalenergymedia.com, where there will be links to everything we discussed today. The Global Energy Leaders podcast is produced by Michael Sims and Chris Prine. Chris Prine also serves as editor for the Global Energy Leaders podcast. Until next time, keep climbing.
Thanks for listening to the Global Energy Leaders podcast, powered by R Squared Global.